What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected legends, a man who has commanded respect for over 6 decades, walks into what should be a routine interview only to face a host who thinks he can use cheap political shots and personal attacks to create viral moments? What you're about to hear is the explosive story of how Clint Eastwood turned a late-night ambush into a masterclass on dignity and strength, and why what happened next became one of the most talked-about confrontations in television history. Make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this showdown will leave you speechless. At 93 years old, Clint Eastwood still carries himself with the quiet authority that made him an icon. When he agreed to appear on the show to discuss his latest directorial project, everyone expected the kind of respectful conversation that befits a man of his stature and accomplishments. The audience was buzzing with excitement to see a living legend, someone who had shaped American cinema for generations and earned the admiration of peers and critics alike. But from the moment Eastwood settled into the guest chair, something felt off about Jimmy's demeanor. There was a smugness in his expression, a barely contained anticipation that suggested he had something planned beyond the usual promotional interview. Eastwood, with his decades of experience reading people both on and off camera, immediately sensed the hostile undercurrent. "Clint Eastwood, everybody," Jimmy announced to the applauding crowd, but his tone carried an edge that made Eastwood's eyes narrow slightly. "You know, Clint, I have to say, it's fascinating having you here. A man who's been making movies since before most of our audience was born." Eastwood's response was measured, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had become legendary. "Well, Jimmy, I've been fortunate to work in this business for a long time. Still love making pictures." Jimmy leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine interest, but Eastwood could see the calculation behind his eyes. "Speaking of making pictures, I'm curious about your perspective on how Hollywood has changed. I mean, you've seen it all, haven't you? The good times, the bad times, the really controversial times." The way Jimmy emphasized controversial immediately put Eastwood on alert. This wasn't heading toward a discussion about filmmaking techniques or industry evolution. This felt like a setup. "Hollywood's always been a place of change," Eastwood replied carefully. "That's part of what keeps it interesting." Jimmy's smile widened, and Eastwood recognized the look of someone preparing to spring a trap. "Interesting is one word for it, but you've had some pretty strong opinions about the direction things have gone, haven't you? Politically speaking?" The studio fell noticeably quieter. The audience could sense that the conversation was shifting into dangerous territory, away from the comfortable celebrity chat they had expected and toward something much more confrontational. Eastwood's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Jimmy, I came here to talk about my film. My political views are my own business." But Jimmy wasn't backing down. If anything, Eastwood's resistance seemed to energize him. "Come on, Clint. You've never been shy about expressing your opinions. Remember that whole thing with the empty chair? That was pretty memorable." The reference hit like a slap across the face. Jimmy had just brought up one of the most controversial moments of Eastwood's later career, something that had been dissected and criticized endlessly in the media. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this had crossed a line from interview into attack. Eastwood's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath it now. "Jimmy, that was over a decade ago, and it has nothing to do with why I'm here tonight. I'm here to discuss my work as a filmmaker, not to relitigate political moments from the past." Jimmy chuckled, but it was a sound devoid of warmth. "But that's the thing, isn't it, Clint? Your politics and your filmmaking have always been connected. I mean, some people would say your movies have pushed certain agendas, promoted certain viewpoints that maybe aren't so popular anymore." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Eastwood stared at Jimmy with the kind of intensity that had made him perfect for playing men who didn't back down from confrontation. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of nearly 7 decades in the entertainment industry. "Jimmy, are you suggesting that my films are propaganda? Are you sitting there telling me that movies I've spent years of my life creating, stories I've believed in enough to risk my own money on, are nothing more than political statements? The host tried to backtrack slightly, but his damage was already done. I'm not saying propaganda exactly. I'm just saying that art reflects the artist, and your art seems to reflect some pretty specific political views. Eastwood leaned back, in his chair, studying Jimmy with the kind of focus that had made him one of cinema's most compelling screen presences. Jimmy, let me ask you something. Have you actually watched my films? Have you sat through Gran Torino or Million Dollar Baby or Unforgiven and come away thinking they were political statements rather than human stories? Jimmy's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. Well, I mean, some of the themes, some of the messages, they seem pretty clear to anyone paying attention. Messages? Eastwood's voice took on a dangerous edge. Jimmy, the only message in my films is that people are complicated, that life is complicated, and that sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. If that's political to you, then maybe the problem isn't with my movies. The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by watching one of Hollywood's most legendary figures defend his life's work against what was clearly an unprovoked attack. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something much more serious. Jimmy tried to regain control of the narrative. Look, Clint, I'm not attacking your movies. I'm just saying that in today's climate, some of the things you've said and done might not play so well with younger audiences. Eastwood's laugh was sharp and humorless. Younger audiences? Jimmy, are you telling me that young people can't appreciate stories about redemption, about second chances, about people trying to do better than they did before? Are you suggesting that basic human decency has an expiration date? The host was clearly struggling now, his planned attack having backfired spectacularly. I think you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to say here. No, Jimmy, I understand. Exactly what you're trying to say, Eastwood replied, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. You're trying to turn this interview into a political debate. You're trying to use my appearance on your show to score cheap points with whatever audience you think wants to see an old man get taken down a peg. Jimmy's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. That's not what this is about, Clint. This is about having honest conversations with public figures. Eastwood stood up slowly, his movement commanding the attention of everyone in the studio. At 93, he still carried himself with the presence that had made him an icon, and his standing sent a clear message that this interview was about to take a dramatic turn. Honest conversations? Eastwood's voice filled the studio with quiet authority. Jimmy, there's nothing honest about ambushing your guests with political attacks. There's nothing honest about inviting someone to discuss their work and then trying to tear them down based on your own political biases. The host looked around nervously as Eastwood loomed over the interview space, his legendary presence filling the studio in a way that made Jimmy seem small and petty by comparison. Clint, please sit down. We can talk about this like adults. Eastwood's expression was one of complete disbelief. Talk about this like adults? Jimmy, adults don't ambush their guests. Adults don't invite people onto their show under false pretenses and then attack them for entertainment value. Jimmy was scrambling now, his carefully planned attack having completely backfired. I wasn't attacking you, Clint. I was just asking legitimate questions about your public statements and your films. Legitimate questions? Eastwood's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had made him perfect for playing characters who could be dangerous when provoked. Jimmy, a legitimate question would be about my directing process, about working with actors, about the stories I choose to tell. What you've done is turn this into a political hit job. The audience was shifting uncomfortably in their seats, many of them pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a historic television moment. They could see that Eastwood wasn't just defending himself, he was systematically dismantling Jimmy's credibility. Jimmy tried a different approach, his voice taking on a tone of mock reasonableness. Look, Clint, maybe I came on a little strong with some of the political stuff, but that's just because people are curious about your views. You're an influential figure. Eastwood's laugh was bitter and sharp. Influential figure? Jimmy, if I'm so influential, then why are you trying to tear me down on national television? If my opinions matter so much, why are you treating them like there's something shameful that needs to be exposed? The host was visibly sweating now, his composure completely shattered by Eastwood's relentless honesty. I'm not trying to tear you down. I'm trying to have a substantive conversation. Substantive? Eastwood stepped closer to Jimmy's desk, and the movement sent a ripple of tension through the entire studio. Jimmy, there's nothing substantive about political gotcha questions. There's nothing meaningful about trying to embarrass your guests for cheap laughs. Jimmy looked desperately toward his production team, clearly hoping someone would intervene and save him from the disaster he had created. But everyone seemed frozen, mesmerized by watching one of Hollywood's greatest legends systematically destroy the host's credibility. Clint, I think you're overreacting here, Jimmy said weakly. This is just normal interview stuff. Politicians and celebrities get asked tough questions all the time. Eastwood's eyes blazed with an intensity that made Jimmy visibly flinch. Normal interview stuff? Jimmy, I've been doing interviews for 70 years. I know what normal interview stuff looks like, and this isn't it. This is a cheap ambush designed to make you look clever at my expense. The veteran actor began pacing, his energy filling the studio in a way that made the host look increasingly insignificant. You know what's really pathetic about all this, Jimmy? You had the opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who's been making movies since before you were born. You could have asked me about working with legends like Sergio Leone, about directing actors, about the craft of storytelling. Jimmy tried to interrupt, but Eastwood's voice cut through his attempt like a sword through paper. Instead, Eastwood continued, his voice building in intensity. You chose to focus on political garbage because you thought it would be easier, more sensational, more likely to go viral. You took the lazy route, the cowardly route, and now you're acting surprised that I'm not playing along. Cowardly? Jimmy's voice cracked on the word. Eastwood turned to face him directly, his presence overwhelming in the confined space of the studio. Yes, cowardly. It takes courage to have real conversations with people, Jimmy. It takes preparation, intelligence, and respect. What you've done tonight is hide behind your platform to attack someone who came here in good faith. The audience was beginning to murmur among themselves, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a celebrity having a bad interview. This was a masterclass in how to handle someone who thinks having power gives them the right to abuse it. Jimmy made another desperate attempt to regain control. Clint, look, maybe we can start over here. We can talk about your new movie, and everyone can just relax. Eastwood's expression was one of complete contempt. Start over? Jimmy, you think you can spend 20 minutes attacking someone's character and life's work, and then just reset like nothing happened? You think you can spread political poison and then ask to start fresh when your victim fights back? The host was clearly panicking now, his voice taking on a pleading quality. I wasn't spreading poison. I was just asking questions that people want answers to. People want answers to? Eastwood's voice rose to a level that commanded the attention of everyone in the building. Jimmy, what people want is to be entertained, to learn something, to connect with the guests on your show. What they don't want is to watch you use your platform to settle political scores or stroke your own ego. Jimmy looked around the studio wildly, searching for any way to salvage the situation. Clint, I think you're taking this way too personally. This is just show business. Eastwood's laugh was harsh and unforgiving. Just show business? Jimmy, show business is about creating something meaningful, about bringing stories to life, about entertaining people in ways that matter. What you're doing isn't show business, it's political theater disguised as entertainment. The legendary actor moved toward the edge of the stage, and Jimmy realized with growing horror that his guest was preparing to leave. Clint, please don't walk off. We can work this out." But Eastwood was already reaching for his jacket, his movements deliberate and final. "No, Jimmy, we can't work this out. Because working it out would require you to understand that what you did was wrong, and you're clearly not capable of that kind of self-reflection." The studio was erupting in whispers and gasps as the audience realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. Clint Eastwood, one of the most respected figures in Hollywood history, was actually going to walk out, and there was nothing Jimmy could do to stop him. "You know what you've shown me tonight, Jimmy?" Eastwood said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the studio. "You've shown me that some people will use any platform, no matter how public, no matter how influential, to tear others down for their own political purposes. You've proven that there are people in this business who value sensationalism over respect." Jimmy's voice was becoming increasingly desperate. "Clint, you're making a huge mistake. Think about how this is going to look." Eastwood stopped and turned back to face the host, his expression a mixture of disgust and disappointment that made Jimmy shrink even further into his chair. "How this is going to look? Jimmy, how do you think this looks right now? How do you think it looks that you invited a 93-year-old man onto your show just to attack him for his political beliefs?" The audience was beginning to stir, some of them starting to applaud Eastwood's stance. They could see what was happening, could recognize that they were watching someone refuse to be bullied by a host who had clearly crossed every line of professional decency. "I wasn't attacking you for your political beliefs," Jimmy protested weakly. "I was just trying to have a conversation about current events." Eastwood's expression turned to one of complete incredulity. "Current events? Jimmy, you brought up something that happened over a decade ago specifically to embarrass me. You questioned the integrity of films I've spent my life creating. How is any of that about current events?" He stepped closer to Jimmy's desk, his presence radiating the kind of quiet authority that had made him a legend. "You know what this is really about, Jimmy? This is about you thinking that because I'm old, because my political views don't align with yours, that makes me an acceptable target for your brand of entertainment." The host was visibly crumbling under Eastwood's relentless assault on his credibility. "That's not true, Clint. I respect you as an artist." "Respect?" Eastwood's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Jimmy, you don't attack people you respect. You don't ambush people you respect with political gotcha questions. You don't try to make people you respect look foolish for the amusement of your audience." Jimmy looked desperately around the studio, his eyes pleading with his production team to intervene and save him from the disaster he had created. But everyone seemed transfixed by what they were witnessing. "Look, maybe I handled some of the questions poorly," Jimmy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't mean you have to leave. We can still have a good conversation." Eastwood shook his head slowly, his expression one of profound disappointment. "Jimmy, we can't have a good conversation because good conversations require mutual respect. They require honesty, preparation, and a genuine interest in your guest. You've demonstrated none of those qualities tonight." The legendary actor began moving toward the exit, and the audience's whispers grew louder as they realized they were witnessing something historic. "You know what the saddest part about all of this is, Jimmy? The saddest part is that you had the chance to talk to someone who's lived through the golden age of Hollywood, who's worked with the greatest directors and actors of multiple generations." Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. "Clint, please, think about the audience. They came here to see you." Eastwood turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying the wisdom and authority of 7 decades in the entertainment industry. "You're right, they did come here to see me. And what they've seen tonight is someone who refuses to be disrespected, someone who won't sit quietly while a host uses his platform to launch political attacks." The applause started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but it quickly grew into something thunderous. The audience was on their feet, cheering for someone who had refused to compromise his dignity, who had stood up to a bully with the kind of quiet strength that had made him an icon. Jimmy sat frozen behind his desk, watching his show fall apart around him. The applause continued as Eastwood acknowledged the crowd with a slight nod, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. "Thank you for your support," Eastwood said to the audience, his voice carrying clearly over the applause. "What you've witnessed tonight is what happens when someone thinks having a platform gives them the right to attack their guests. Remember that respect is earned, not given, and it can be lost in a single moment of poor judgment." As Eastwood walked toward the exit, Jimmy made one final desperate plea. "Clint, please don't leave like this. Security can escort you back to discuss this privately." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and everyone in the studio understood immediately that Jimmy had just made the worst possible move. Eastwood's expression shifted to one of complete amazement, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "Security?" Eastwood's voice was quiet, but it carried such intensity that it seemed to fill every corner of the studio. "Jimmy, you just called security on me because I refused to sit here and be your political punching bag? You think the solution to this situation is to have me forcibly detained so you can continue your attack?" The audience's booing was audible now, their disapproval of Jimmy's tactics becoming impossible to ignore. Even his own crowd was turning against him, recognizing that he had gone too far beyond any reasonable boundary. Eastwood shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of sadness and contempt. "You know what, Jimmy? That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you are. When faced with someone who won't be bullied, your instinct is to call for force. When confronted with your own unprofessional behavior, you try to silence the person calling you out." The security guards were approaching hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they had been thrust into. They could see that Eastwood wasn't being threatening or disruptive. He was simply trying to leave after being treated with profound disrespect. Eastwood held up his hand to the security team. "Gentlemen, it's fine. I'm leaving voluntarily. I wouldn't want to spend another minute in this environment anyway." He turned to address the audience one final time, his voice carrying the weight of nearly a century of life experience. "I want you all to remember what you saw here tonight. You saw someone in a position of power try to use that power to tear down his guest for political entertainment. You saw what happens when someone refuses to be a victim of that kind of abuse. And you saw how that person in power reacted when his tactics failed." The applause was deafening now, the audience on their feet cheering for someone who had refused to be diminished, who had stood up to political bullying with the kind of quiet courage that had defined his entire career. Jimmy sat in his chair, staring at the chaos he had created, finally understanding that his attempt to score political points had succeeded in ways he never intended. He had indeed created a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. But he had also revealed himself to be someone who valued political theater over basic human decency. The last image of that unforgettable night was Clint Eastwood walking out of that studio with his head held high, having turned what was meant to be his political humiliation into a masterclass on dignity and strength. He left behind a host who had learned too late that some legends cannot be diminished, no matter how hard you try, and an audience who had just witnessed what real courage looks like when faced with the kind of political bullying that has become far too common in modern entertainment. What do you think about Clint Eastwood's response to Jimmy's political attack? Should celebrities be expected to just take this kind of treatment? Or was Eastwood right to call out the host's unprofessional behavior? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories about what really happens when politics and entertainment collide.